evening, ladies and gentlemen. There's nothing like having an intimate lecture. This is fantastic. Just a show of hands. How many of you are members of the Adams County Historical Society? Raise your hand. Holy mackerel. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. I'm Bob Scapini. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees. And I have to say thank you, because you make this possible. This is so important to continue the history of Adams County. And tonight, you are going to be amazed. As a matter of fact, if you look left or right, I think there's a seatbelt that you might be able to put it on. It's going to be amazing. So, with that, first, I want to give a big thank you to the Dobbin House for sponsoring all of our 2020 programs. Big hand, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Jackie. And also tonight, this is a first. So you're all part of this first. Tonight we have Community Media. Community Media is a nonprofit company established to inform, celebrate, and entertain the people of Adams and York County. You can check their website, www.communitymedia.net. If you'd like to see more community programming, just like this, it's recorded and televised. Please tell your municipal officials to support community media with the cable franchise fee they receive, because you get to see stuff like this, and your grandkids and your nieces and nephews as they play sports. Speaking of that, growing up as a kid, we didn't have cable, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have streaming videos, we didn't have any of that stuff. So Sunday afternoon, Dad would say, let's get in the car. And my dad was a firefighter, and we would drive through town, and he would go, you know, there used to be a... And over there was the coal place where we used to go and pick up... Oh yeah, over here, there was a delicatessen. Remember those days? It's like... So it was an imaginary trip through town. Remember this, remember that. Oh, I remember this. And Mom would get in on the act. And my brother and I would sit in the back seat, and we're looking. We don't see it. But tonight, you get to see it. You get to turn the page back and take a look at Gettysburg from the past, because tonight is a very special lecture series. We have three of the most knowledgeable local historians ever. We have Lisa Shower. She's a licensed town guide, tour guide at the Rupp House, researcher, writer, and author, and a longstanding member of the Adams County Historical Society. We have tonight Jane Malone, also a licensed town guide, researcher, author, public school teacher, and member of the Board of Trustees of Adams County Historical Society. And the famous Gene Green, the unofficial mayor of Gettysburg, independent history researcher, writer, author, speaker, and an authority on local buildings in Gettysburg. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jane for the first presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Jane Malone.
I love places that don't exist anymore. So this program appealed to me particularly. And when we thought about what buildings we were going to do, I have to say that my mind immediately went to the old courthouse. And that's because, let me if I hit the right button here, that's because I got so tired of correcting people when they would say the old courthouse, and I would go, well, we have an old courthouse. Oh, I was hoping they wouldn't remember.
She also does Bing Crosby.
I got tired of saying, when people would say, well, the old courthouse, and I would go, You mean the 1859 courthouse? They go, yeah, the old courthouse. And I'd go, oh, but there was an older courthouse, and no one knew where it was. So I have an opportunity to just spend a little bit of time talking about the 1804 courthouse, and I'm going to grab it. And I'm going to hold this microphone. Can you hear me? Yep. Right here. I'm not making a single gesture, because otherwise my voice will fade and go in different directions. What I'm going to do is speak about our first courthouse, 1804. It was one of the two original buildings that we absolutely had to have in order to be a county. We needed a courthouse and we needed a jail. So how did we get this courthouse? We become a county in 1800. Within 4 years, we have those two major buildings. James Geddes gifted the land and the ground rent from the land to the county in order to provide for these two buildings. But that wasn't enough. 13 Gettysburg citizens executed a $7,000 bond to cover the cost of construction of the two county buildings. Collecting this from the subscribers for that bond was challenging, but in the end, by 1804, both buildings were up and functioning. There were many ads in the newspapers saying, if you don't pay soon, we're going to be filing suit. But eventually, I guess everyone paid up. We have just 2 images of our original courthouse and a couple of verbal descriptions. So I'm going to show you the 2 images. If I can find the right button. This is image number 1. It's a really lyrical drawing of our center square, because our first courthouse, despite the disbelief I hear in many people's voices when I say it was there, was built right in the center of Center Square. It was right where the flagpole sits right now. This picture makes it look very roomy there. I don't think it was terribly roomy. I don't know the date of this, but it's a nice way to start. The reality, I think, is actually more interesting. Some of you may find this familiar. Others of you may not have seen it before. This is the 1804 courthouse. And I'm going to do what I said I wasn't going to do. I'd like to point out this figure right here. That's a man. So you can see that this is not a really huge building. It's not all that tall. It's not all that wide. It doesn't hold all that much stuff. The building was described by contemporaries, and keep an eye on it, I think you'll find that they were pretty accurate, as square. It was made of brick. It had a large door in the center of each of the 4 walls. Its 2 stories were surmounted by a cupola that held the town clock, a bell cast in Philadelphia in 1804, and a weather vane that topped it off. This building stood in our town square for over 50 years. But it wasn't alone. It was a crowded place. From 1807 to 1852, the courthouse shared Center Square with an open brick market house that stood 12 feet from the eastern courthouse wall facing York Street. So these doors are oriented north, south, east, and west. And out that York door, the east door, 12 feet away across the alley, was a market house. The northern door opened onto Carlisle Street. That was never opened because the judge's bench blocked it from the inside. The southern door, which opened onto Baltimore Street, allowed entry into the building, and it was the only way you could get in or out. The western and eastern doors to Chambersburg and York Streets were opened only for the purposes of ventilation. So, as a visitor coming into the building, what would you see? After stepping inside the southern door, you would enter, not surprisingly, a square room. Directly ahead of you, you could see the judge's bench, which was raised to about the height of the middle of the northern door. On either side of the judge's bench, at floor level, would be the jurors' seats. Members of the bar sat in front of the jurors, facing the judge. In the rest of the room, in the rest of the room, facing the judge's bench, were very, very high-backed benches for spectators. Now they said high backed and they said high, but they all say benches, so I'm not sure how many of these actually had something you could lean back on, but clearly they're pretty rudimentary, or they would call them something other than benches. An aisle ran down the center of the room. And so if you imagine the kind of courthouse we go in today, it's pretty much the same configuration. Lawyers sat in front of the jury boxes. They were facing the court, the judge as well. I'd like us to go back to the door, the entry space. Let's go back to the entry. We're at Baltimore Street. When you entered at that point, you could have turned right or left instead of going straight, in which case you would have gone up a staircase. So there were staircases on either side of the door. If you went up the west staircase, you would come to a low gallery which ran along the western wall of the building, and that was filled with rows of hard benches. So this was a gallery that overlooked the courtroom. If you went up the staircase on the east, you would reach an eastern gallery that was a replica of the one on the west. But you could keep going to another floor where you would come to a landing and you would be facing 3 doors. There were 3 small rooms on this second floor for the petite jurors, the grand jurors, and for an all-purpose room. None of them were very big. But you'll notice in this description that I've given you that I haven't said anything about judges' chambers. I haven't said anything about workspace for clerks or other county employees. I haven't said anything about storage for county records. Probably in the midst of actually doing the building, they realized that this building was totally inadequate, and almost as soon as it was finished, the work began on a county building that was built in the northeast quadrant of the square, just across the street from that east wall. That went up very quickly because the only thing they could do was have a trial. They didn't have any place to actually do legal work or county work, and the courthouse was supposed to take care of that. But despite this small size, the 1804 courthouse worked for trials very clearly. It was efficient. People came in. People complimented this courthouse. They said, oh, it looks a little bit like a smaller version of the Lancaster County Courthouse. And the people in the town were pretty grateful for that. But they noticed over time that this courthouse wasn't used all the time. And since there were times, substantial amounts of time between court terms, weekends, and in the evenings when it was empty, and they were frugal people, they decided that they could use this for things other than legal cases. And the courthouse very quickly becomes a community venue. I was really impressed with the variety of groups which met in the courthouse on a routine basis. And it's this non-legal use of the courthouse, this community use of the courthouse, that did catch my attention, and that's what you're stuck with hearing about tonight. And so I'm going to go through what's going to sound like a lot of list. In the first decade, it was used regularly for weekly worship by the combined congregations of the German Reformed and Lutheran churches until their new Union Church was completed in 1814. So for 10 years, we had Sunday service at the courthouse. In the 1820s, the Methodist congregation used the courthouse until its first church on Middle Street was completed. And over the years, other congregations followed this pattern. They used the courthouse for Sunday services as they built or they remodeled their homes of worship. Many public events occurred in the courthouse. In 1811, the public was invited to attend the first temperance speech that was ever made in our town, made by outsiders, by the way, not by visitors, not by residents. In the 1820s, groups like the Adams County Society for the Promotion of Agriculture, Raising Stock and Manufacturers met in the courthouse regularly. There was this sense of community growth, especially back in the 1820s. The founding of the Sabbath School Society took place in the courthouse in May of 1820. Public debates on various subjects were held in the courthouse all the time. I did not want to list all of them for you, but I did want to make note that of the very first lecture and the type of lecture that seemed to be the most popular was theology. Benefit concerts began appearing at the courthouse as early as the 1830s. This community knew how to use the space that they'd paid for. Meetings to discuss the day's hot topics often began at the courthouse, but didn't always continue. For instance, the Adams County Anti-Slavery Society had its first meeting in the courthouse in December of 1836. What the organizers didn't realize was that the businessmen of the county, who really had a very southern view, a very southern connection in terms of where they sold the things that they made and the products that they produced, they didn't really want to have any anti-slavery meeting in their courthouse that might disrupt their southern markets. And so they got there first. And they simply would not allow the Anti-Slavery Society business to be conducted. So the group moved over to the Gettysburg Academy, finished their organizational business there, and then made the decision that from now on they were going to meet in Petersburg. That's today's York Springs. And so they never did come back to the Adams County Courthouse. But there were other issues, such as the removal of the Cherokee Indians and other Indian tribes from Georgia that created quite a stir in the newspapers, and ways to protest the taking of Indian land were held in the courthouse in the 1840s. There were expected gatherings like the meetings of the Gettysburg Fire Company to reorganize, and they reorganized many times and elected annual officers at those reorganizations. There were meetings of the political parties at private homes, but also at the courthouse. In the 1840 election, the supporters of William Henry Harrison for president organized their efforts for his election at the courthouse, and there was a big payoff because Harrison came through Adams County and held a political rally in the 1804 courthouse, and of course he ended up winning that election, so they felt like real winners here in town. The first convention of the county school district directors met to discuss how to procure teachers for the school systems in town here in 1840. In the 19th century, if there was a group in Adams County, chances are it met first, once, or many times in our local 1804 courthouse. Besides being too small, the courthouse was not very comfortable. In a letter to the editor of the Gettysburg Star and Banner, a man who identified himself only as Franklin described his less than happy experience as a juror in the 1852 winter term. It was cold and it was snowy when he made his way to the courthouse in January, and his story is not a happy one. And I'm going to read a little bit of his letter to the editor. When I arrived in town, court had convened, and almost frozen and exhausted, I sought the courtroom, hoping, though hardly expecting, for some comfort for my tired limbs. Alas for my expectations! I found I was fortunate in being able to get within the door. And then my condition was in no way improved. He goes on to discuss the water and the slush underfoot. By a persevering effort, I was enabled to penetrate the shifting mass of half-frozen men and gradually approach the stove. The stove, heated to an intensity, resembled most two dazzling masses of infernal fire whose warming influence could be felt in a magic circle immediately around them. All their rays fell powerless without. Everyone who has ever been in the building knows of the problems. The want of ventilation, bad construction, no seats, and generally an absence of every modern comfort and convenience. But what is to be done to remedy the difficulty? Franklin says, build a new one. And he wasn't the only voice asking for a new building. The process to replace this courthouse that I just love began in 1857 with the purchase of lots on Baltimore Street, where a new courthouse was built in 1858 and opened in 1859. And I do call it the new courthouse. But in the 1804 courthouse, there was an opportunity for one last moment of glory in the summer of 1858. On Wednesday, September 1st of that year, the borough celebrated, along with, I think, almost all of settled North America and Europe as well, they celebrated the successful completion of the laying of the first Atlantic cable between North America and England. I had no idea we were that invested in technology back then. But on that day, even though I'll tell you this, but they didn't want to admit it then, by that time it was clear that the cable had already failed. On September 1st, Gettysburg celebrated. The sky was lit by fireworks, cannons were fired in the air, bonfires blazed, the bells in the churches and the public buildings rang for an hour, the militia fired volleys in the air, and the citizens' band played in the courthouse, which was illuminated from cellar to belfry, in the words of the compiler. It was a most impressive evening, and that was the 1804 courthouse swan song. Demolition of the courthouse begins on May the 3rd, 1859, just hours after the picture on the screen was taken. The process was quick, but not without human cost. On May 9th, the newspapers reported the accidental death of one of the workers. He had been hit by a piece of falling timber. And at first, they didn't think it would be too bad. He'd only broken his leg. But they say the shock of the accident killed him. I'm wondering if it wasn't the shock of the infection that he sustained when all of that old wood and everything else came down raining on him. The courthouse, as we see it there, is gone, but I want to reassure you that pieces of the courthouse are still with us. The 1804 bell was moved to the cupola of the second courthouse in 1859, along with the weather vane, and that bell has rung since 1859. And 1804 courthouse bricks were sold to several men who were building new homes at the time. So it's very possible that 1804 bricks survive in the old David Kendallhart house on Baltimore Street across from the courthouse, and in the Henry Fonstock house on the corner of Washington and Middle Streets. So when you go through Lincoln Square and you see the flagpole and you think how crowded it looks with all those cars going around, it was a lot more crowded before 1859. And I hope when you go by you'll keep that image of our old courthouse in hand and be grateful that it's not winter and that you're not serving on for jury duty. So thank you for listening to the 1804 courthouse. And now we go from a lost public building to a lost private home. And Lisa Shower is going to come up. You got it? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hello, everybody. How are you all? That was great, Jane. Thank you. When Jane and Jean and I and Bob and whoever else was in that committee meeting started talking about this program idea that we had of lost buildings, we all agreed that one of them ought to be Civil War related. And I'm the lucky one who got that one. A little over 10 years ago, Bobby Hoosh, with his Gettysburg Daily, filmed a South Baltimore Street tour with me when I was an active town guide. And when we started saying what building is lost that was significant to the battle, that tour I did for Bobby popped right into my head. And that's the Samuel McCreary home. It would have been located along South Baltimore Street, right across Lefevre Street from where Mr. G stands today, or Twin Sycamores would have been at the time of the battle. Mr. McCreary had owned the home since about the late 1830s, early 1840s. I'll talk a little bit later about why some of these dates are not exact. He and his wife Maria raised a family there. He is he's about a 60-year-old man at the time of the battle. But according to the 1860 census, his occupation was a brick maker. He had a brickyard beyond the property that he owned, along what today those of us who know the battlefield well know as Wainwright Avenue. It's part of the Park Service today, but was at one point called Confederate Avenue, and even earlier than that, Brickyard Lane. So Mr. McCreary, his wife Maria, and 3 children at any given time lived in this home. According to the 1860 census, we have, excuse me, according to the 1860 census, we have Samuel, age 60, Marie, his wife, age 58, Robert, his son, age 19, and Mary, a daughter, age 14, as well as a worker of theirs, William Adair, age 27. Their eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was obviously out of the home by that point. At the time of that census, sorry, I lost my light, sorry. At the time of the census, I don't remember numbers well. The older I get, I'm sorry, the older I get, the harder it is for me to remember numbers. That's why I wanted to read these. Oh, yes. Thank you. Where is it? There it is. There we go. Sorry about that. At the time of this 1860 census, the real estate value of Mr. McCreary's property was $1,600. His personal estate value was $800. And we know, of course, that was valued at, in today's monies, that would be valued at a whole lot more because he was obviously a fairly well-off businessman and resident. I read many newspaper articles that showed that he was active with city government, borough government, I should say. He worked with establishing, he had some things to do actually with the establishment of the courthouse, Jane, along with some other leading townsmen. He was fairly well-to-do. And as the summer of 1863 approached, I'm sure that he was just looking at his retirement years with envy. He was looking forward to that, and nothing was ever really going to shake his steady existence until those first 3 days of July in 1863. I'm going to read a quote before I go into any details. It is from a letter dated July 19th, I believe, 1863, from John Rupp. Most of you might be familiar with that letter. I'm only going to read a short segment, but John Rupp tells us, "The Rebs occupied Mr. McCreary's house, from which they could pick off our men as they pleased. Our sharpshooters found it out and kept a lookout, and timely shot one in Mr. McCreary's front room upstairs and killed him on the spot." This is the story that a lot of us who are familiar with the battle here in town are familiar with. Corporal William Poole of 9th Louisiana was a soldier that Mr. Rupp described in that letter. He had gone into the house. The McCrearys, if I remember correctly, are in their basement. Yeah, I believe they were in their basement. Poole had gone into the house, up into a second floor room. Picture, if you will, twin sycamores that we just talked about a bit ago. Twin sycamores, the McCreary house, the John Rupp house, and a few others, Solomon Welty being another one. There were several houses in that neighborhood that were architectural twins. So if you picture that second-story balcony in Twin Sycamores today, the only one that exists relatively unscathed, Poole goes up into the second floor, finds a drop leaf table, pushes it out towards those railings along that second floor balcony, and is firing at Union sharpshooters within close distance of him. We don't know exactly where he was firing. Given the location of the house, he was probably firing in the direction of someone at the Farnsworth house or the Shriver house or somewhere on that western side of Baltimore Street. Well, those Union sharpshooters were firing in his direction as well, and one of them hit their mark. Corporal Poole is killed. His body falls where he had been fighting, and after the McCrearys come back into their home, they are left to deal with a dead body of a Confederate soldier in their house. And according to the accounts, Mr. McCreary and a neighbor will wrap the body up, pick it up, and take it out somewhere along Long Lane. They will bury it there and mark the grave. There are conflicting stories on whether or not Corporal Poole's body was retrieved. Interestingly enough for me personally, after that Gettysburg Daily video tour that I did with Bobby Hoosh, I don't know, sometime afterwards, I had an email from a young man in Louisiana in the early 2000s named Mark Poole. He had been doing some research on his genealogy, and he found my tour that I did for Bobby on the internet. It was interesting. He was asking me all kinds of questions. It appears that Corporal Poole would have been the brother of Mark Poole's however many greats, grandfather. So he believed that the body had been returned to Louisiana, that his parents had come and retrieved it at some point or another. But again, there are conflicting stories about that. After the battle, of course, Mr. McCreary continued on with his livelihood, or possibly one of his family members did, because by that point he's in his mid-60s. And in 1877, he has a public sale and sells his home as well as his property. His wife had died 2 years earlier. His children are married by this point and moved to other places. He will have a public sale. It was advertised in the compiler, and this is where some of the dates really start to get interesting. During my research for this project, I had so much help. I was working on it by myself for a long time, making steady headway, and then both Randy Miller and Tim Smith at the Historical Society became aware of what I was working on, and they wanted in. Because if you know both of them, the town lots and the early origins of each of these properties are right up their alley. And so I said, why not? Take advantage of their research skills. I have good ones, but theirs are best. And yet, despite the fact that they have the research skills that they have, key dates just kept eluding us. We just struggled, and Randy was going home at night doing it. It was crazy for a little while. But in 1877, we now know for a fact, actually, where is that? Here's the deed. Randy found this deed only 2 weeks ago, and we've been working on this for a couple of months. But Tim was going at it one way, I was going at it this way, and I don't even know how Randy did it, but he found it. We see the recital of the owners there. The property actually did not change hands that many times. It's purchased by Mr. McCreary from his brother-in-law, John Houck, which is another name familiar to those of us who study the battle here. And in 1877, Mr. McCreary sells the property to Margaret Huber. Her husband, John Huber, is another name for those of us who are town guides we might recognize. He was a druggist farther down on Baltimore Street, closer to the square. She owns the home for what we thought at first was an indeterminate amount of time. The key date the three of us were looking for here was, when did the house come down? So once again, when Randy finds this deed, we found the answers to several of our questions. Margaret Huber buys it in 1877. The recital says that in 1901, Milton Plank purchases it. And if you look up at the top left, if you can read it from there, I'm not sure if you can, it says, May 2nd, 1925, Milton Plank sells the property to the school district of Gettysburg. And that was the key to why we weren't finding it the first time. We were looking Gettysburg School District, Gettysburg Middle School, Gettysburg High School, School District of Gettysburg. And that's how Randy found it. So 1925, all three of us were like, whoa, we didn't think it came down that early. When does we didn't think it was sold that early, excuse me, I just used the wrong terminology. We didn't think it had been sold that early, but when does the house come down? I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly tonight when that house comes down, but we also dug into the Sanborn fire insurance maps. And let me just show you while I'm talking about that. A couple properties, I'll talk about this in a second, but the house is there behind the parade that you see. The Sanborn Maps of 1931, when we first opened them, we were so excited. The house was gone. It was not on the map. So if the property was bought in 1925, that indicated that the house came down almost right away. And then Randy blew that bubble because he pulled another Sanborn map out that had corrections in it. And that one showed the house there. So, we are still not 100% confident, but based on the fact that the corrections were made in the Sanborn map, they were dated, there was a couple different dates, but they were dated between 1948 and 1952. We believe the house stood till about that time period. Also, during my research, I reached out to the Gettysburg Alumni Association to see if any one of them could provide me with any dates, which they did not. But the one lady who responded to me answered, well, this house was already gone by the time I went to middle school there in 1954. So that 1948 to 1952 is as close as we're going to get for now. But trust me, if any of you want to know in the future, keep asking me, because I know Randy for sure is not done digging. I have a feeling when I go back on Thursday, we're going to continue with this project, because we were close, but we just couldn't get it for the time for tonight. The photos, though, that I'm sharing with you, actually Tim was responsible for pointing me to. This one's in the collection at the Historical Society and shows a Memorial Day parade in 1940s, roughly, in the 40s. Now, the house does not look like twin sycamores that I told you about earlier. Obviously, I told you it was an architectural twin. But in later years, it's modified and a mansard roof is added, which changes its look completely. But if you look over here, in that far left corner, what does that look like? Twin sycamores, I suspect. It's not the clearest shot, but it's in the right area. And then this one. It's not great. Oh boy, that came out rough. Okay, I'm sorry. Is it okay? Can you turn the lights down a little bit for me with this one? Where is it? Where is it? I don't know how I do this. Oh, well.
I think they're around the side.
I don't know where the lights are for this. He got him. He got him. He got him. Okay, good. Oh, much better. Oh, thank you, goodness. Tim just got this picture a couple weeks or a month ago or so. He's been doing these tours at the Farnsworth House on Sunday nights, and somebody came up to him with these pictures on this guy's phone. And the people you see in front are not important. They are actually family members of the person that gave Tim this picture. But what you see here is the south side of the McCreary house. It's taken along the side. If you look over here in the far left of the photograph, you're looking across Baltimore Street at the western side towards the Farnsworth house. So we got a couple nice peeks at the McCreary house, but unfortunately nothing of any great except for this postcard, which I found online. Again, it is a postcard. It does show the house in its altered form with that roof change line especially changing. But most significant in this photo is something that we all read about when we read the Civil War account, the bullet-ridden fence. The fence line stood there for many, many years. Obviously, it came down, as I said, in the middle of the 20th century. But when I first started visiting Gettysburg in the 1980s, I remember seeing a portion of that fence up at Lee's headquarters, up here at General Lee's headquarters. So I hope to be able to someday be able to answer your questions better about exactly when that house came down. But it is a significant building as it relates to the Civil War history here in Gettysburg. Thank you. I'm going to pass the torch over to Jean Green, who in a way blends what Jane and I just did. Jane helped you understand more about a public building. I described a private residence, and Jean's was both.
Thank you, Lisa. Now I'm going to try, and you heard the term before, chew gum and walk at the same time. I'm going to try and hold this microphone and try and use the little laser here and change the slide. And I think I can do it, but bear with me. Okay, what we're going to talk about this evening is the building that stands on West High Street, 141 West High Street. This is a fascinating building with a fascinating history. We're now going to travel to the southwest part of Gettysburg. And we're going to start out with the layout of this building here. This building here, and I'll try and use this, and if it doesn't work, I'm just going to walk over. This building here was first in Troxell's addition. And Troxell's addition is not working. Okay. Well, anyways, Troxell's addition would come down like from the corner here down to High Street. And these sections right here would be the building 141 West High Street. This building, as far as I know, was built around 1885. There was an article in the paper that right across from Agricultural Hall, F.A. Gintling would build a building, and this would be this particular building that we're going to talk about. The building was sold to the Wazowski family. Sorry, got ahead of myself here. In case you don't know where you are, this sign, West High Street here, and you see the sign for the beer distributor, you will actually cross this street here and go across, and you will come to a building. I will talk about where the building is located later on, but I wanted you to get a sense of exactly where the building stands. This is the deed, and this would be the first people after the building was sold. The building was owned by the Wazowski family. They would sell it to the Lincoln Club of Elks. This particular club would have many, many names. Lincoln Lodge, the Colored Elks, and whatever. But this took place in 1909. They would have formed in 1908. And here's an article from the Gettysburg Times, February 1908. And you can read the Lincoln Lodge of the Improved Benevolent Protective Order of Elks. And it was formed. And this lists all of the persons that are now with this particular organization. And you see here, there's a number with a membership of 45. And these are the officers. I'm going to pull a name out of this particular one, this Clinton Carter, because that person is important to my family. And here is a photo of some of the gentlemen. In the front row, we have Harry Clay Sr., Clayton Moxley, Pappy Desnett. I tried to find out what his real name was, but they just call him Pappy. And William Reed. Back row, we have Harry Clay Jr., David Stanton, Walter Carter, Mr. Himes, Adam J. Myers, and Walter Daniels. These are some of the earlier officers of the Colored Elks. Now this is a photo that, now I'm going to give you my interpretation of this photo with all of these folks in front of here. There are 45 members of this club. I think all 45 members and their family are in this photograph. It may be the whole community, but it's how I interpreted this photo. It could be the whole community, or the 45 members with their families. I pulled out a name earlier from the original members of the Colored Elks. This person here is my grandfather's sister, and she was married to Clinton Carter, one of the first members of this organization. The Lincoln Lodge, the Colored Elks, they did pay for the building. As you see, they did have a mortgage burning. And I think that here says something for the organization, that they bought this building and they actually paid for it. And there you can see the members that are now in there at this time here. Now, I think Pappy's name was George, but I just couldn't find him anywhere in the newspaper. I found him in the census, but I could not find if that was, because there were some other districts in there also. The colored community was all about the community, and it was a thriving community. These are some of the things that they did for the community, like feeding the children and having different things for them. And I thought that was wonderful. Now, we're going to move on to the Colored Elks would sell this building in and around 1935. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but the building, if you would see anything in from whenever they sold the building and further on, it would still be referred to as the Colored Elks building or the Lincoln Lodge building. And this would continue after it was the Savoy Tap Room. Now, it was purchased by Samuel M. Stanton. And it was purchased in 1936, and it was purchased from the Adams County National Bank. Now, the Colored Elks afterwards, and that's sort of like, when I saw that it was the Gettysburg National Bank, I was like, okay, now what's going on here? But they would sell it to him. And in his deed, when he would pass on and give it to his wife, and I read the deed and I was like, oh, okay, I'm understanding it now. He would not hold the Savoy Tap Room that long. As you see, he was found dead. That murder is still unsolved. And there's a picture of Samuel M. Stanton. I think he's a very nice looking gentleman. And here is an article about his funeral. And take note who the pallbearers were. Now, he is buried in the National Cemetery. He is not buried in Lincoln Cemetery. There was another Samuel Stanton that is buried in the Lincoln Cemetery. Okay, so he would pass on. So he leaves the place in his deed to his wife. And she would sell it to Norman Tipton. This building had me a little puzzled because it's an interesting building. I would find articles where someone had died at 141 West High Street. And I knew that was the Colored Elks. I knew it was the Savoy Tap Room. And I'm like, okay, are they living there? Well, yes. When Miss Louise, and I call her Miss Louise because I knew her as a child, when she sold this building, I love this because it does describe what kind of building it was. It had 5 rooms and a bath on the 2nd floor. And I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense. No wonder I found articles where people were living in this building. But what I don't understand is, how can you live in a building and there's all this activity going on in the building? I don't know. I can't imagine that they said, okay, we're going to have something here tonight, you gotta leave, you know. So, but evidently they worked things out. And, but I thought it was a very, very interesting building. Now, okay, so we move on. So now, Mr. Stanton passes on. He leaves the building to his wife in his will. But she has not sold the building yet. So different things are going on in this building. We have furniture men on strike. I'm assuming they're renting out this building for these particular things that they're having. And you can see that it's at 141 West High Street, union meetings. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is a universal building here. Okay, this is an actual bill stating, and you can see that it says West High Street, okay? Also, other notices here, 141 West High Street, some other things that were going on in this particular building. So this building was being used for all different sorts of things, almost like the courthouse. It's like, okay, we don't have anywhere to go, courthouse isn't available, we're going down here. Bingo. Bingo every night. This would run until 1930. I had 38, but it would run until 1939 here. Bingo. Who doesn't love bingo? Still all different types of things going on still. And you see that, let's see, they still refer to it as the colored Elks. The Elks have long since sold this building, but they still refer to it as the Colored Elks building. And when I say the black community was, it was involved in their community. They were proud of things that they did. GOP. Oh my goodness gracious, now that sort of had me a little, but I tell you what, before blacks were Democrats, we were Republicans. My brother still is. I didn't know that until I was riding with him, taking him to a doctor's appointment, and he was talking to me, and I looked at him, I'm like, what? You've been my brother all these years? I never knew this.
Miss Green, remember that most blacks were Republican because
And yes,
Republicans were the ones that were anti-slavery.
yes, and I do know that.
Thaddeus Stevens,
Yes.
Lincoln, and
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yes, and I do know that. Just a little humor in that, and I do know that. Okay. Okay, now we're going to fast forward to 1947. This building is the most interesting, sought-after building in the black community here. So now we have Home Association, and it seeks incorporation. So, and it also lists the members that are involved in this. The building is now sold. Norman Tipton is now selling this building to James Mauston. Now it will take on another title. Okay, so now it takes on the Dorsey Stanton Post. Okay? And I'll give you time to read that here. Okay, now this is an actual picture here of the Post, and this is in 1947, taken in 1947. as I was looking through this, and this gentleman over here, there was a headshot of him, and I got this from the Historical Society. There was a headshot of him saying, unidentified man, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's Mr. Jim, that's Jim Mauston. And this is what the club looked like when it was first finished. Oh my gosh. Okay. So here we have the Negro Legion Post 986 formed 1947. When it first formed, it was supposed to be named after Joseph A. Williams. Joseph A. Williams would be my grandmother's brother, my great uncle, and if any of you knew or read the article where I traveled to France last year to visit my great uncle, that would have been him, Joseph Williams. And the post was to be named after him. However, somewhere along the line when they were going through and putting this all together, I don't have the actual article, but it did say they changed their mind. And so now we're going on to they actually.
Excuse me, Jean.
Beverly, can we wait until afterwards, please? Okay. Okay, so they're forming the, and I think I pulled out this again so you can see it a little clearer here where the post was to honor my great uncle. Now on the other side, this is one of the gentlemen that the Legion was, the Colored Legion was named after. But as you go down and you read, and it will say, the Dorsey Stamp Post of the American Legion was named for Seaman Dorsey and for Albert Stanton, who was killed in Germany. So it's a dual. And I'm not sure if this is the only dual Legion post. The majority of them have one name, and this may be the only dual name Legion post. And here's the rights for us. His name is Sterrett Dorsey, and he was killed in 1945. And the other gentleman is Albert Stanton. So it's Sterrett Dorsey and Albert Stanton. These are the two that the Legion was named after. And as the Colored Elks, they would hold various community things here. And this here, now I pulled this out because this I find interesting here. And on the right-hand side, you will see that Helen Dorsey, which would be Sterrett Dorsey's mother, was the only Gold Star mother. And she was the only one. My great-uncle's mother, she did not even live to see him go into the war. She died in 1904. Whenever she was honored in 1960, when I was reading this, I just loved what she said as she told the group. And I'll give you a minute to just skim over that. And she just loved the part that it had to do with God and country. And that just sort of touched my heart. Sadly, the Dorsey Stanton Legion would be set ablaze, and this was in March of 1979. Now, And you maybe cannot see this clear. But this is the deed. After the Legion had caught on fire, it sat there for until about 1984, from 1979 to 1984. And at that time, Charles Sterner and his wife would purchase the property. And Charlie Sterner, I'm quite sure that some of you might know him. The building at the rec park is named after him, the Charles Sterner building.
Not the same person.
It's not the same person.
Not the same person, no.
Oh, okay.
It's a different person.
Different person.
Okay, well, I stand corrected. Now, this particular building here, now this is what the Legion would look like prior to it catching a blaze. And this is what it would look like today. The front of the building came the whole way out to the sidewalk. Now, if you go to the building present day here, you will see that it does not come the whole way out to the present sidewalk. The front of the building was so badly damaged that they could not save it, but the back of the building they could save. And so that is what is still standing of the building today. Now, if any of you have gone down High Street and you've seen this building in the middle, that is what's standing of the Colored Legion today. This building on this side has always been there, and the building on the other side. Those buildings have been there ever since this building here was built. Now, has anyone ever gone down the street and wondered, why does that building set back from the others?
When Rick and I first leased that apartment, we wondered the same thing.
Well,
Rick
that's
lived
why.
there.
That's why.
Oh, that tree's gone now, isn't it?
Now, this may seem a little out, but I had to put this in because when they celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Colored Legion, George Elliner had a trio, a band. Does anyone know who George Elliner was? Okay, so he has a connection with the Historical Society. So when I saw this, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have to pay him a little tribute here. So he helped out with his singing ability, him and his group in the black community. And that concludes my talk on the Colored Elks, the Savoy Club, and the Dorsey Stanton Legion, and now the present apartment building.
Super job, super job. Let's give a round of applause, everybody. Come on up. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 2 minutes worth of questions, so it's going to go real fast. So, anybody got a pressing question for our presenters? Yes, sir.
The clocks on the 1804 courthouse, were they also relocated to the current courthouse?
They were going to be put into the second courthouse. I can't honestly say that they were. They were replaced by they were replaced. The ones that are there now are not those clocks. The 1804 clocks never worked. But then again, I've been by lately, the clocks aren't working now.
They don't work now, yeah.
But I can't remember the date that the other clocks went in. I think that was it was after the battle, but they're different clocks.
Yes, ma'am.
Somebody told me that there used to be copper mines where the courthouse is, and the people who were mining it gave up because they couldn't keep the water out.
Under St. Francis
Under
also,
St.
suppose that
Well,
St. Francis.
I've heard that. I've also heard people say,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
I've heard that, and I want to tell you, I like that a lot. But what I have seen that makes more sense is it's just a natural waterway, natural ravine that just connected those areas. And occasionally things just drop through. But I have heard that rumor that there was mining, and there certainly was an attempt to have a mining industry in this area, but it never went very far, and I can't believe they would have done all that digging for very little return, so.
There was a copper mine that never found much copper, but the shaft is up on West High Street.
Yes.
The old Hutchinson home.
Right, near St. Francis, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Excellent. Yes, sir, one last one.
On the entrance to the mine on High Street. It could be a secondary entrance, but in the basement of St. Francis,
Yeah.
there's a tunnel that we're all told, don't go in there.
Yep, yep,
And the other one is in the basement of Ping's Restaurant.
Yeah.
yep,
Outstanding.
that's right.
Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming. If you have any questions, go to Facebook and type in a question. Our staff will get back to you. Next month, Dr. Henry Stewart, man of mystery and a Renaissance man of Gettysburg and Adams County. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay.